Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today I'm going to be analyzing and predicting the 2020 U.S. Senate race. So just so you know, shortly after this video is released, I plan to go live on Twitch. And I've been going live on Twitch just on and off for like the past week or so, or the past few weeks, I'd say. And my plan in general is to start to do a more, politically controversial topics and things like that on that channel, and I'll reserve, just election predictions and things like that. I'll do it in this channel. So if you want to watch more, current topic political discussions on more controversial topics, and see me debate people as well, I went live on there with political politics gaming. If you guys know who that is, I had about a 2-hour long discussion with him on Twitch on the Minnesota riots, like a day after they happened. And that was a lot of fun. I plan to do more stuff like that on there, and if you guys are interested in that, I'll link it in the description below. Okay, so just to start off, I'm going to be talking about New Mexico first. Although a lot of pundits have been saying that this race is likely and not solid for Democrats, and even leaning for Democrats, as though there's some sort of, as though this race is competitive, I'm going to be rating it as solid blue. And my logic for this is that although there's a lack of incumbency advantage in this state, and I feel like that's the main reason that a lot of people have been pointing to this state as a competitive state, is because there is an incumbent retiring. Although that absolutely does make this race more interesting than it would be rather, I do think that the Democrats have this locked up, and that's because they have a candidate, Ben Ray Lujan, who has been a big name in the House for a very long time, and he's a member of the Democratic leadership in the House as well. He has the backing of Nancy Pelosi. He has the backing of all the high-profile members of the Democratic leadership, and already that gives him a huge advantage over whoever the challenger would be. And the challenger in this case to him is going to be Mark Ronchetti, who is a weatherman out of New Mexico. And I really do think that the Republicans could have picked, someone with more political experience than a weatherman. I'm not saying that isn't a combination that couldn't win. Obviously, I think that there are obviously scenarios where people with virtually no political experience could win elections. Obviously, I just think that this lineup between Mark Ronchetti, who has virtually no political experience whatsoever, and Ben Ray Lujan, who right off the bat has just more backing and more funding and just more of a solid ground to stand on in New Mexico. I just think that this makes this race a solid, and even not considering the Republican candidate, New Mexico in general, I don't think should be considered anything but solid for the Democrats in races across the board, whether that's the presidency or in the Senate, if we're talking about statewide races. So just in general, I'm going to be listing New Mexico as solid for the Democrats in the Senate. Now going over to another state that I meant to fill in, toss it before, Tennessee I'll be filling in as a solid red. And again, this is another state that has Lamar Alexander, the incumbent senator here, is going to be retiring, and that's the main reason why people are viewing this as a competitive race, just like New Mexico, incumbent retiring. But again, I don't see this going to the Democrats. We saw how this state played out in 2018 with the Senate. It was really built up. People thought that Phil Bredesen was going to make some ground here, and for a while it looked like he was going to win. But in the end, it just ended up being, he lost by 16 points, I think, something like that. It was not a good turnout for the Democrats in this state. And in general, I think that the age of just, conservative Democrats, or maybe more blue dog Democrats, having a chance in these southern states, and maybe even in off-year elections. This is an off-year election, which is another reason why I think this is not a good state for Democrats to campaign in. I just don't think that Democrats have any chance in this state anymore whatsoever, whether or not it's midterm, whether or not it's any kind of statewide election. And that's another factor that I'm going to be considering throughout my analysis of this race, is that this is going to be coinciding with the presidential race. Last time I did election predictions was 2018, an off year, and that was a big consideration because the turnout is not usually going to be the same in a midterm for a presidential election, as most people probably know, and that plays a big role. But here we have the same level of turnout, the same level of focus for a presidential election that we're going to be having for Senate as well. And that's a big factor, because very rarely will a state go one way in a Senate race and then go another way in the presidency. It doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, it's usually because of big exceptions. So for the most part, I'm going to be listing states that are aligning closely to where it's going in the presidential race. That doesn't mean there are not going to be exceptions. There could be exceptions through my analysis, but just to give context, that's going to be a pretty big factor when considering the outcome of each of these races. All right, so now going into the likely states, I'll be casting Alaska as likely for the Republicans. And again, this is another race that is being considered and viewed as competitive or slightly competitive. And the incumbent Republican here, Dan Sullivan, did win very narrowly in his last race, though that was a completely different period for Alaska. It was against an incumbent Democrat in this state who lost very, very narrowly. That was a big race 6 years ago when Dan Sullivan ran for the first time. But obviously Alaska isn't the same in terms of political makeup as it was, 6 or 10 years ago, back when Obama was running. The Republican makeup in the state is much more prominent, even in off-year elections. We did see in 2018 that this state did almost go to the Democrats. The Democrats came pretty close to winning the state in the House, but I think that's mostly a result of the Republican candidate or the Republican incumbent for the Alaska at-large district, who's been in his position since Nixon was president. So I think it's just a completely different consideration there. But yeah, I do think that there is some chance for the Democrats to make up ground here, because Alaska is always going to be a bit of an unknown factor, especially when considering non-presidential races, just because of how sparsely populated it is and how just any kind of shift in dynamics could make a difference here. But still, generally friendly Republican state, Republican incumbent. I'm going to be listing it as likely Republican. Now going over to South Carolina, we have Lindsey Graham running here. I'm going to be listing this state as likely for Lindsey Graham and the Republicans. The main reason why I think this state is competitive is just because of Lindsey Graham as a senator. He's had a bit of a contentious past. I mean, South Carolina, I don't think it's definitely a Republican state, but it isn't very strongly pro-Trump Republican state. I think they would probably, if he's received critiques, Lindsey Graham, for being as ardently pro-Trump as he has been, despite the fact that he's also been a big criticized him very often before he became president. So Lindsey Graham has been receiving criticism for that. He had a bit of a primary challenge, not as much as people thought he would. And then you have Jamie Harrison, who's on the Democratic side, which is honestly probably the best Democrat that they could run in the state. He was a former member of the Democratic Party leadership. He's got a huge financial backing. He's got name recognition throughout the state's Democrats, and I do think that they'll make it slightly competitive, but I don't think there's a huge chance for Democrats to win the state, especially in a presidential election where the state is favored to go to the Republicans no matter what, pretty much in the presidency. So I don't think that we're going to see that exception happen for South Carolina. Now going down to Alabama, this is the first state that I'm going to be flipping, and pretty early. I'm going to be flipping Alabama from the Democrats to the Republicans, and this obviously for most people isn't a surprise. Doug Jones won in extremely strange circumstances back in 2017, I believe it was, when Roy Moore was accused of sexually harassing and assaulting underage girls, and that was the main factor that pushed Doug Jones to become elected, just because nobody was turning out for Roy Moore, and the people who were just writing in other Republicans for the most part. So obviously, and the most interesting part about this race really comes down to the primary. It's going to come down to between Tommy Tuberville, the former local college football coach, and Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General for Donald Trump, who and it's going to be interesting just because Tuberville has the backing of Trump. Sessions, despite being Trump's former Attorney General, who was ousted by him and now is still belittled and critiqued by Trump, is saying that he has the backing of Trump, even though he obviously doesn't. But it's still going to that primary in of itself is going to be interesting just to see who comes out on top. But either way, whether it's Sessions or Tuberville, I don't think that this state has a very strong chance of going out of going into Doug Jones' column. And for that reason, I'm just going to list it likely for the Republicans, regardless of whether Tuberville or Sessions wins. Now going over to Kentucky, I'm going to be listing this state as likely. A lot of people are viewing this state as very competitive, just given the fact that there's always been. It was this way the last time Mitch McConnell was running for re-election as well, I believe. Just that despite the fact that Mitch McConnell is the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate and has immense power as a politician, his electoral stance is very shaky. Kentucky does not like Mitch McConnell. He has I believe, on average, he's been the lowest approved of politician, just in terms of which state they represent just on a regular basis. But I still think that this state, despite the fact of having such a low approval of Mitch McConnell, is probably not going to vote for a Democrat over Mitch McConnell. I mean, we did see in the governor's race that a Democrat did win here, but the governor's race is an entirely different ballgame when we're talking about Kentucky. If we're talking about the Senate, I don't think that Amy McGrath. I think that Amy McGrath was probably the best candidate they could have nominated for this race, just in terms of being a moderate Democrat with name recognition and good military background as well. Doesn't hurt her in the state, but I don't see it going, especially, again, presidential election year. People are going to be voting down the ballot. Republicans who are turning out just for the presidency are going to vote down the ballot for every Republican. I'm not saying that's obviously not going to happen across the board, but that's a big factor when you're talking about presidential elections. And so for those reasons, I would not list Kentucky as being anything less than likely for the Republicans. Now going over to New Hampshire, I'm going to be listing New Hampshire as likely for the Democrats. This state generally, just across the board, I would list likely for Democrats. And we've been seeing this in 2018 as well. The Democrats locked up both House seats here, despite the fact that at least one of them was listed as toss-up by around 10 or 15 points they won it by. And just on a statewide basis, I mean, I don't see this state going back to the Republicans. I think that the only reason it's likely for the Democrats and not solid for the Democrats is just by the margins that they're ahead by. We're talking about like margins within like 10 or like slightly less points, and for anything like that, it's going to be, it can't really be solid. It has to be likely. But Jean Shaheen, who is the incumbent here, is going to be running against Don Bolduc, who is a member of the, I believe he's a lieutenant general of the military. Again, not a bad Republican choice. But even then, incumbency advantage, a state like New Hampshire, which has been more and more friendly towards Democrats in recent years, I'm going to list it as likely for the Democrats. Now going over to Kansas, I'll be listing Kansas as likely Republican. And again, another race that people are probably going to disagree with. We saw in 2018 that Chris Kobach, who was the very mildly controversial Trump-supporting Republican who lost the governor's race in 2018, and is now running again and has a pretty decent chance of winning the nomination. He's going up against Representative Marshall, who is a more, I think, moderate Republican. And that's the main thing, just like South Carolina, the main thing with this state is that it's solidly Republican. Nobody's denying that these two states, Kansas and South Carolina, are solidly Republican. But it's about Trump. It really comes down to Trump in terms of how much the Republicans support him or don't support him. And if they are given the choice between a strong Trump-supporting Republican and a moderate Republican who maybe isn't as strongly supportive of Trump, but still, is pro-Trump just in general, being a Republican, they're probably going to pick the moderate. But as we're seeing here, it's split between Kobach and Marshall, and we still don't know how that's going to play out. But regardless of whether or not Kobach, I'll take that back. I think that if Kobach does win the nomination here, this state could very well move from likely Republican to leaning Republican if I do another prediction, and Kobach wins at that point. But even considering that, I think the only reason this state went to the Democrats is one, it's a governor's race, which is a different kind of set of considerations when you're compared to Senate races or House races. But it was also an off year. And now we're going to be going into a presidential year where, like I said, people are going to be voting down the ballot, just party line. And I think that those factors together are going to make this state likely Republican, even though the Democrats have a pretty solid candidate. They have Barbara Bollier, who was a Republican right up until 2018. So they're just picking the most centrist Democrat that they can, the Democrat who's just as much Republican as possibly can be. So I think that does also make this state a bit more competitive for them, just because I think that Bollier is going to have a good shot at maybe splitting away more moderate Republicans to the Democratic side. But we'll see. This state could very well move into leaning territory as we see this race develop in the next few months. But going over to Minnesota, I'm going to be listing Minnesota as likely Democrat. And we saw this in 2018, where Tina Smith, who won in the special election by around 10 or 15 points, now she's the incumbent. Now she has that incumbency advantage. The Republicans don't really have anybody of great significance running in their primary, so I don't think that that's going to be too much of a factor. And again, I'm listing the state just as likely blue, same way that it is likely blue for the presidency. I think that, again, the presidential race is going to be a big factor here. And just given the fact that Tina Smith does have a solid hold on the state, and she had good showing in 2018, despite the lack of incumbency advantage. I think that the odds are in her favor. I'm going to be listing it as likely. That going over to Michigan, I'm going to be listing Michigan as likely as well. A lot of people are looking at the state and saying that it should be leaning, and I would understand that, especially considering the Republican nominee. It's John James, who made a name for himself by running for the other Senate seat in 2018 against Debbie Stabenow, and lost by a margin less than people predicted he would lose by. And now he's running again against Gary Peters, who has a lower approval than Debbie Stabenow did. And so a lot of people are looking at this race and saying that it should be leaning Democrat, or just less likely for Democrats, if anything. But again, I think it really comes down to the presidency. I think that if Joe Biden's standing in Michigan and even in Minnesota loosens in the next few months, then it could be reflected in the Senate races as well. But for now, Joe Biden's standing here is solid. I think that Joe Biden's standing in general being so solid as it has been in the past month or two does contribute to how well the Democrats are doing in the Senate race, and I think that's reflected especially in the Rust Belt, which has been going back and forth for the past few months, and it will probably continue to go back and forth, but we'll see in terms of that. But for now, likely Democrat for Michigan. Now going over to the main Senate race of Georgia, I'll be listing Georgia as likely red for the Republicans. Here we have the incumbent Senator Perdue, who is going up against John Ossoff, and John Ossoff made a name for himself by running in a special election for the for a district in 2017 that was shortly vacated, and he lost, and he hasn't really been in prominent in politics ever since then. So I don't think that John Ossoff really is the best choice for the Democrats to make. Instead, like this, I think going up against Perdue is really just. I think that the main factor here is going to come down to the presidency. I know I keep saying that, but there's no definitive factors on either Republican side or Democratic side that puts it either in their favor. So it's really just going to be a mirror of how much of where Georgia's demographics are in general. And so I'm going to be listing it likely, which is exactly what I would list it for in the presidency as well. The special Senate race is a separate discussion, which I'll talk about later on. I think there's a bunch of different factors that go into that one. Going over to Colorado, I'm going to be flipping Colorado from the Republicans to the Democrats, and this really shouldn't be a surprise to many people. I've been seeing Colorado being listed as toss-up, as even leaning, but I'm going to be saying it's likely for the Democrats, just because it has not gone to the Republicans ever since the senators running here, Cory Gardner. Cory Gardner's Senate race, I believe, was the last time the Republicans won statewide. And I could be wrong about that. There could be some lower-level statewide race that was won by the Republicans in the past few years, but Cory Gardner has been and still is the highest ranking Republican in the state, and his shaking is very, very flimsy. I don't think he's done anything whatsoever in the past few years to distance himself from Trump and to try to establish himself as maybe a more moderate Republican, more friendly towards the demographics and political makeup of Colorado. And then you have the Democratic candidate, which is John Hickenlooper, the former governor, who resigned with very high approval, had a very good tenure as the governor, had a short run for presidency before dropping out, which didn't really affect him or impact him that much. And so I think that this is Cory Gardner's race to lose. I don't think that there's a chance in hell that Cory Gardner has a chance to win re-election here. I would honestly place his odds like almost lower than Doug Jones here, who's a Democrat running in Alabama. So yeah, I would say that Colorado is locked up for the Democrats in general. I don't think there's a whole lot of concern there. I think the only level of concern is obviously incumbency advantage. You know, we always have to consider incumbency advantage for the other side. But still, this is a state that has been basically solid Democrat for years now, and I would list it as such now, especially considering the fact that it's also a presidential election. And I'm going to be going over to Texas. I'll be listing Texas as likely red. I do think that there's a chance that this state can slip into leaning territory for the Republicans, depending on how things go. I do think that there's a lot of unknowns here. I mean, we saw how Beto O'Rourke's run went here in 2018. He came within about 3 or 5 points to defeating Ted Cruz here, even though the polling was against him pretty much right up until the end. Beto O'Rourke, I think, really ran a great campaign here, and I think even though he lost, he did push a lot of Democrats into the House in a number of races here just on his coattails pretty much. And honestly, the Democrats really could have made this race a toss-up if they had just ran Beto O'Rourke, and I think that Beto O'Rourke was really, really foolish to run for president rather than for focusing his efforts on Texas. I think that was very foolish of him. And even if Beto O'Rourke hadn't run, I think that Joaquin Castro, who's the brother of Julian Castro, would have been an excellent candidate to run for the Senate here. Again, didn't run. I don't know why. But we have M.J. Heger, who is a member of the military on the Democrat side, who's running against Cornyn, who's been a staunch and strong member of the Republican leadership, second only to McConnell, I'd say, in the Senate for years now. So already they have a war chest. They have a lot of funding on their side. I think that the Democrats could have made this race competitive, like I said, but I don't see that happening with the current way that things are going. And I think that the number one factor is, again, going to be how well Joe Biden does in Texas, which doesn't really seem like it's going to be Joe Biden's going to be focusing his efforts on Texas in general. Democrats don't really seem like they're focusing as much attention as they should be on Texas overall, whether or not it's the Senate or for the presidency, just because I think the general mindset of Democrats is that Texas is becoming more competitive, but it's just not their time yet, so it's just not worth it from the go after. But we'll see if that gamble pays off for them, I guess. Oh, I forgot to fill in Virginia solid blue. My bad. Now I'm going to be going over to leaning states. Montana has become very interesting in the past few months. I'm going to be listing it as leaning red. We have Bullock, who is the former or current governor, rather, who's termed out now, who's been the Democratic governor of Montana for the past few years. He also ran for president before dropping out before the primaries. But I think that Bullock gives the Democrats their best possible chance at flipping that Senate seat in Montana, which would make both Senate seats in Montana blue if Bullock did win, which is something that would be shocking in this current political period where Montana is solid red in the presidency, but both Senate seats are blue. That'd be an interesting dynamic. But again, I do think that Bullock was the best possible thing that could have happened for Democrats in Montana, and I think that's going to make this race more competitive, more interesting. Could move in the toss-up territory, more tilt territory as we go forward, but we'll see. And we'll see how much attention Democrats want to give to Montana in relation to other, perhaps more competitive states. In Arizona, I'm going to be flipping Arizona from red to blue, leaning in Mark Kelly's column. And this is something that a lot of people would probably disagree with, but Mark Kelly has been running a solid campaign from day one. He has a solid level of name recognition. Being an astronaut always gives you a big boost in any kind of Senate race, that kind of name recognition, that kind of profile. He has a huge background being the husband of Gabby Giffords, who was the representative who was shot in a mass shooting, and has been a big name for Democrats and for gun restriction legislation for years now, and has been a big name in the Democratic Party for a while. And then you have Martha McSally, who has been who was appointed to the Senate seat after losing against Kyrsten Sinema in 2018. She was appointed to it, and I don't think her level of approval is very solid in this state. I don't think that I don't think she's been doing a great job at really playing to the state's more moderate Republican nature. Instead just going all out for Trump and not really trying to make an effort to moderate herself at all in that regard. So for now, and we could see this change if Martha McSally and the Republicans start to panic about the state, which I imagine they will start to do as Mark Kelly continues to lead in the polls and continues to look as solidly as he is. But for now, looks very good for Democrats to lock up both Senate seats after winning the other one in 2018, to lock up the other one now in 2020, and we'll see how that plays out. But for now, it's looking to be in the Democrats' column. Now I'll go over to the special Senate race in Georgia. I'm going to be putting this leaning in the Republicans' column. Again, this race is kind of a mess. The way these special races go in Georgia is that every single candidate runs together, meaning that you can have like 3 Republicans and like 4 Democrats all running in a single race where you have to vote for one of them. That's what we're seeing now. We're seeing Kelly Loeffler, who was the Republican appointee to this state, who was backed by Trump over Doug Collins, despite the fact that Doug Collins was a pretty ardent supporter of him during the impeachment trial. And Kelly Loeffler was a political outsider. She was a bit more of a just an outsider to politics in general, which is how she defines herself in relation to Doug Collins, who was been a career politician, has been a staunch supporter of Trump regardless, and is, after being denied the appointed position of senator, is now running against Loeffler for the race. And then you have the two Democrats on the other side. You have Lieberman, who's the son of Joe Lieberman, who was the high-profile Democratic candidate, who I believe was who was the running mate for Kerry when he ran in 2004. I'm not sure, but Joe Lieberman was a big name in the Democratic Party. Now his son is running here, and then you have Warnock, who I believe is a pastor here. He has good name recognition. He's African American as well, which is really good for a state like Georgia if you're a Democrat. So again, it's just a mess. It's four candidates running together, and we'll see how that plays out. And then there'll be a runoff. The top two vote getters will end up running, and that could be a number of different outcomes. So this race is very difficult to call, just given how chaotic that all is. But yeah, and I'm going to be calling. Moving on from that, I'm going to be calling Iowa a leaning Republican. I meant to call that earlier. I think that the Democrats do have a chance, a higher chance of winning in the state when considering the Senate over winning it in the presidency. And this is because although the Republican incumbent here, does have a pretty solid hold on the state in general and has good approval across the state overall, the Democratic challenger here has been making a pretty substantial fundraising effort and has gotten a pretty substantial part of the farming support amongst the state, and that's really what's going to come down to a state like Iowa, is how much the Democrats can campaign to those farmers, how much they can make them concerned of Trump's tariffs and everything like that, and that's what it's going to come down to in the state, which I don't think is going to. I think it's going to make the state competitive, and I could see the state moving more likely to the Republican side as it starts to align more closely with how the presidential race is going, when considering how well Joe Biden is doing in this state, at least. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out there. For now, it's going to be leaning for the Republicans. Now going over to the tilting states, which is essentially toss-up. I'm going to be listing Maine as tilting blue. And again, very difficult race to call. You have Susan Collins, who has been the incumbent here for almost, I think, 30 years, which is crazy, even for considering long-term incumbents. And in the past, she has won solidly. Her last race, she won by about 20 points. But demographics and the makeup of Maine in general has been shifting very sharply. Susan Collins, in general, her strategy has been has been to just go as left as possible while still remaining a Republican. I would argue that she's even more to the left than Joe Manchin is, the Democrat from West Virginia, just in terms of political ideology. And I think that she's just been doing that in reflection of how her state has been voting, just relying on her being more of a trustee rather than a trustee for the reflecting how the state's general makeup is, rather than being a Republican. And then you have Sarah Gideon, who is the former Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, I believe, who was running against Susan Collins and has gotten the support of organizations like Emily's List and all kinds of women's rights organizations who are putting a huge amount of financial support behind her. And again, I think that this race is going to really come down to how Susan Collins voted with Brett Kavanaugh. Although that probably didn't provoke national outrage towards her in Maine, which is generally viewed right now as being more Democratic friendly, that did provoke outrage, and still a main campaigning point for Gideon. And I think that that's going to be an important factor here in terms of whether or not Susan Collins is winning. And for now, it does not look like she's favored to win. Sarah Gideon has been leading pretty solidly in the polls. Republicans don't seem to be putting as much attention as they should be on this state. And yeah, we'll see how it plays out then. I don't think that in general Susan Collins being such an apologist in terms of her Republican ideology is great for her in this state, but again, she's dug herself into that hole a long time ago, and I think that at this point all she can do is just keep on going forward with, being basically a centrist Democrat. So we'll see how that plays out in this state. And then the last race I'll be calling is North Carolina. I'll be calling that tilting towards the Republicans very, very narrowly. We've been seeing this race that Cunningham, who is running against Tom Tillis, the incumbent Republican, has been doing very well in the polls. I believe the last time, 2 days ago, he was leading around 10 points above Tillis, which is pretty significant. But regardless, I think that this state I think the Democrats really should have nominated someone better, an African-American perhaps, to run in this state, just because that's really the big make-or-break demographic when it comes to North Carolina, whether or not Democrats can win here. And it's for that same reason that I would call North Carolina not in Joe Biden's column for now. It's just because they need to be playing more to the African-American vote. And again, the more moderate, suburban white vote does play a big factor here in terms of just statewide races, just because that vote is split pretty evenly between Republicans and Democrats, and a shift there could change the whole race. But still, I don't see this race going out of Tom Tillis' column and into the Democrats unless Democrats really start to change how they're campaigning here. That's not to say they couldn't win. Cunningham has been leading solidly despite those demographic factors being against him, and if that does continue, I could very well begin to call it tilting for the Democrats, but I guess we'll see as it goes. Okay, so this is the Senate map. I have the Democrats winning 2 more Senate seats than they did in 2018, picking up seats in Arizona, Colorado, and Maine, while losing 1 Senate seat in Alabama. Overall, like I kept saying, just races in general, and it'll be the same way if I ever do a House of Representatives prediction, are just going to be closely aligned. If it's during a presidential election, it's going to be closely aligned with that, just because, I know it's not the best way to predict, and it's not the way that people would like these races to be predicted. You want to be using more like substantial and solid factors, but still, it's very rare to see a state go one way, like I said before, to go one way in a presidential election, then go another way in a Senate race. It's very rare to happen. That's not to say it can't, and we could very well see that occur. But for now, this is the Senate race. I would say the Republicans have about like a 50-55% chance of holding it. Right now, it's looking very shaky for them. It's looking right now, the Democrats are looking better than ever in the Senate, and this is mostly due to just changes in states like Montana, which wasn't competitive until Bullock ran. Arizona, which Mark Kelly has been holding up very well, and in Colorado especially, which is now looking solid in their column, regardless of whether they put a huge effort here at all. So right now, Democrats, if they want to win, should be focusing all their efforts onto North Carolina and Maine and Montana as well, just to give Republicans a reason to be scared. If they can start to shift Maine more in their column, if they can start to shift North Carolina out of the Republicans' column and into theirs, then they could be looking at a Democratic Senate, depending on if Joe Biden wins or not, which will be a factor if we're considering a 50-50 split in the Senate. That would be the VP deciding that factor. But still, Democrats have a very good shot at winning here, and we could very well be seeing these states move more towards their column as the months progress. Alright, so thank you for watching. I plan to put out more election prediction videos after this one, maybe a House prediction video on the most competitive House races shortly after. And again, like I said at the beginning of the video, you can feel free to check out my Twitch channel. We're going live right after I upload this video, and you can discuss there. I'll probably be talking for like a few hours just about anything happening in local politics. I'm still starting out on Twitch, so you can really, honestly, the discussion can really go anywhere at this point. But yeah, if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out, and I can have a discussion. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you.